Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today stems from a truly relentless critique of religious belief found within the source material. A sweeping work that meticulously traces the entire history of faith from its prehistoric roots all the way to its modern forms. And the underlying tension the text provokes is really about the nature of modern religion. Does its persistence represent a fundamental continuity with, say, primitive fear and irrationality? Or has intellectual and moral evolution driven modern faith toward a transformed, more rational state?
That's the central question, isn't it? The source material details how religion originated in the groping mind of primitive humanity. It was born out of ignorance of natural causes. Shadows, echoes, the mystery of life and death, and all of this birthed these crude, fearful superstitions. So the issue for us is simple. Does this entire religious evolution, from the savage's idol to the modern cathedral, demonstrate an essential continuity of irrationality? Or has intellectual and moral progress actually finally transformed religious thought, making those ancient foundations obsolete?
I'm going to argue that profound intellectual shifts and our evolving morality have actually refined or, in some cases, even replaced those primitive foundations. Modern faith, I think often through necessity, has been compelled toward a transformation, distinguishing itself from the savage superstitions of the past.
And I will maintain that despite any intellectual veneer applied over the centuries, the core emotional mechanism and the fundamental doctrines of modern religion remain functionally identical to the crude superstitions from which they evolved. I see religion today, just as the material portrays its history, as a constant structural menace to civilization. So, to argue for continuity, we have to look at the foundation. The material asserts pretty unequivocally that the fundamental ideas at the base of all worship today are just as crude as they were 4,000 years ago. They're rooted entirely in primitive fear and ignorance. The very persistence of religion, in spite of centuries of scientific enlightenment, demonstrates this unwavering intellectual crudity. Think about primitive man, ignorant of why lightning struck or why the sun moved. He just invented spirits. The modern mind, facing the myriads of complex scientific phenomena that still elude total comprehension, simply attributes these gaps in knowledge to a new polished idol, a supreme being, or an intelligent designer. More concretely, the contemporary methods of worship mirror precisely the savage cycle of fear, placation, and tribute. The savage, he begged his idol to watch over his meager flock or to grant rain. Today, the modern individual prays to the deity to intervene in natural processes, prosper their business, or, in a ridiculous but very pointed anecdote from the source, to cut down his golf score. The physical sacrifices of old are replaced by money offerings, but the core attitude of transactional tribute remains. We are told explicitly that this offering is tied to the expectation of a high-interest repayment. Give to the Lord and he will repay you manyfold. This is not evolution, it's economic sophistication applied to ancient, self-interested begging. The structure of faith itself, rooted in relic worship and veneration of images, is a direct heir of primitive fetishism.
I see the power of your focus on unobservable mass practice and that emotional underpinning of fear and transaction. I do. However, I frame that persistence of ritualistic crudity as, the lowest common denominator, not the definition of the whole. If we look at the intellectual leadership of faith, there is an undeniable transformation. The internal pressure detailed in the source material has forced an intellectual reformation. Look at the most cultured modern thinkers grappling with theism, figures like the physicists Jeans and Eddington, or philosophers like Weeman. They have fundamentally denied the anthropomorphic God you rightly identify as the core primitive idol. They executed a massive intellectual retreat, redefining the deity from a personal, judging tyrant to an impersonal supreme power, a cosmic force, or even a pure mathematician. This is a philosophical departure of monumental scale. The caveman worried about the spirit under the rock. The modern theologian grapples with the mathematical structure of the universe as a substitute for a deity. And crucially, the material shows that morality is social, It's generated by evolving human fellowship independent of divine revelation. Modern ethics are fundamentally not based on the barbaric laws you find in the Old Testament. The overwhelming historical conflict, the sheer embarrassment of the church's past, proves that the secular, moral, and intellectual conscience of mankind has actively forced organized religion to abandon its most barbaric precepts. This isn't continuity, it's transformation by forced necessity, where external progress modifies the interior of faith.
I frame that philosophical retreat not as a noble transformation, but as evidence of intellectual bankruptcy, a frantic attempt to escape ridicule. If the core mechanism is unchanged, the transformation is merely superficial. Let's return to the nature of modern devotional practice. You highlight the esoteric redefinitions of God by a few intellectuals, but the vast majority of believers engage in the begging and tribute cycle. Why then do modern houses of prayer actively employ techniques designed to subvert reason? The text points out that the construction, the deliberate shutting out of natural sunlight, the installation of semi-darkness, the rise and swell of the organ, is specifically designed to overcome the senses and subdue rational thought. This is the modern, sanitized version of the shaman's incantation. The entire structure plays upon our unstable emotions, aiming to arouse the brutish passions of supernaturalism, a direct echo of primitive magic, awe and fear. The aim is psychological manipulation, to make the individual feel small and overcome by an immense unseen power, and thus ensure subservience. That psychological trick is the continuity of irrationality in action.
I acknowledge that ritualistic architecture is designed to elicit strong emotion, but the intellectual capacity for doubt that has arisen in the modern era is profoundly new. The very existence of rational criticism has changed the playing field. Primitive man, living in a world defined by shadows and fear, lacked the intellectual foundation to even conceive of systematic doubt. The material illustrates this change beautifully when it introduces the concept of the Martian visitor, an alien intelligence that could rationally and without emotional bias analyze human suffering and the problem of evil. This visitor observes things like, say, the agony of a woman in childbirth or the agonizing death of a child from tetanus, and concludes that any God permitting such ubiquitous and unnecessary pain cannot possibly be both omnipotent and benevolent. That capacity for a detached, rational dissection of the deity's nature, that is an intellectual development that fundamentally disrupts the primitive relationship of unquestioning fear. The modern believer has to contend with that rational analysis. Furthermore, the most powerful evidence of displacement is practical. Consider the shift from believing disease is caused by devils, as prescribed in the Old and New Testaments, to the universal, secular adoption of scientific medicine. Even when the church resisted medicine initially, the scientific method, which rejects authority and mystery, has so thoroughly pervaded our thinking that the text calls it the most disintegrating force that is shattering the religious foundations. The fact that the ultimate argument presented in the material is the inevitable doom of religion through atheism proves that a successful, transformative, intellectual, and societal process is already well underway, making the old model obsolete.
I can't accept that the essence is changing when the moral foundation is utterly rotten and still widely published as divine revelation. Let us focus on the textual anchor. How can a faith claim transformation when its sacred core, the Bible, the Quran, contains manifest absurdities, internal contradictions, and, most damningly, moral endorsements for practices like slavery, human sacrifice, and even cannibalism? The material documents the Old Testament's priestly texts as deliberate forgeries, drastically altered and combined centuries after the supposed events to create a false history of God's covenant. The goal was to establish authority, not truth. This reliance on fabricated, historically inaccurate texts that sanction the slaughter of enemies and demand the stoning of witches means that the faith remains structurally anchored to its most barbaric roots. The claim of transformation rings hollow when the divine authority being cited is fundamentally, morally, and historically crude. The priest relies on authority just as the shaman relied on authority to enforce obedience through fear of punishment.
I concede the textual flaws immediately. The source material is explicit that the Old Testament abounds in stupidities and errors. But the very recognition and rejection of this textual barbarism is what drives the necessity of intellectual transformation. We have to stress that the development of morality modifies the gods, not the other way around. Morality, justice, and opposition to murder are not mystical concepts. They are emergent properties of social life and human fellowship. The source material's conclusion is profound. It is not the gods who moralize man, it is man who moralizes the gods. If society decides that slavery is wrong, then believers must either abandon their faith or force their God to change his stance on slavery, overriding the plain text of Scripture. And to prove this moral separation, we can look at empirical evidence regarding civil behavior. The statistical fact is that most criminals are religious, and absolutely and proportionately smaller numbers are non-believers. This is a powerful demonstration that moral energy, the force that keeps society functioning, comes not from the fear of hell or the rewards of heaven, but from human fellowship and societal law, overriding the barbaric sanctions of old Scripture.
That moral progress, though welcome, only came through violent, protracted conflict, showing that religion is inherently an obstacle, not a guide. I want to provide some concrete historical evidence of this destructive continuity, which shows the primitive mindset remains structurally embedded in organized religion. Take the witchcraft delusion. This was not a minor primitive mistake. This resulted in the torture and burning of hundreds of thousands of people across Europe, and it was an organized religious mania directly sanctioned by the Bible. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. This barbarity was endorsed by the greatest intellects of the age, men like Aquinas and the jurist Bodin. The defenders of the delusion argued that to reject the historical evidence for witchcraft would be to strike at the root of all historical evidence of the miraculous. Their reliance on ancient religious texts justified mass murder. Take the witchcraft delusion. This was not a minor, primitive mistake. This resulted in the torture and burning of hundreds of thousands of people across Europe, and it was an organized religious mania directly sanctioned by the Bible. And beyond this atrocity, the church has historically been the enemy of every science. It persecuted Galileo for teaching a spherical and moving earth, a concept already known to classical Greeks, and condemned works on geology and anthropology for centuries, insisting that the careful inductions of science must always conform to the myths and legends of the Bible. This long history of deliberate, often violent opposition proves that intellectual rigor is fundamentally incompatible with the tenets of faith, and that supernaturalism acts as a perpetual menace, always ready to enforce barbarity when given authority.
The dissenter is absolutely correct that religion acted as a constant, savage barrier to progress. However, the existence of that very conflict and the development of the material's central thesis on the necessity of atheism stems from the success of secular intelligence in defeating the theological stronghold, forcing the transformation we're discussing. Consider the church today. In what the material describes as its final, most desperate stand, its last extremis, it no longer primarily prosecutes heretics or denies the earth is round. Instead, it attempts to hijack scientific findings. It grasps desperately at the philosophical speculations of physicists like Jeans and Eddington, the very men I mentioned earlier, trying to shoehorn God into the remaining gaps of cosmological understanding. The source material views this attempt at concordance as dishonest and forced, precisely because science has won the intellectual war. The fact is, after centuries of anathematizing geology, astronomy, and anthropology, the church is now compelled to retreat and attempt to fit its ancient concepts into the framework of science. This shows a complete societal and intellectual surrender of the old primitive authority. The scientific method, which renounces blind authority and relies on demonstrable evidence, has so successfully shattered the foundations of supernatural explanation that the primitive model is now entirely unsustainable for any thinking person who lives in the modern world. That isn't continuity, that is forced, painful obsolescence driven by external rational progress.
But the mechanism remains the same. The reliance on emotional appeal, the transfer of responsibility for complex moral choices to a supreme being, the invention of gods to fill the gaps in our knowledge, whether the gap is where shadows come from or where dark matter resides, the core engine is identical. I submit that the material demonstrates clearly that religious faith is fundamentally an ancient blunder and a monstrous apparition whose core mechanisms of fear and intellectual subservience persist today regardless of how elegantly its most sophisticated adherents dress up the arguments. The primitive emotional core is what sustains the millions, making the transformation you cite a thin crust over a bubbling core of irrationality.
I maintain that the progress of secular intelligence and the evolution of human morality have successfully challenged and, in many ways, overcome the iron grip of theology. The intellectual crisis facing modern faith, where the most sophisticated adherents are forced to strip the concept of God of personality, of supernatural action, and even of moral authority based on Scripture, shows that the primitive roots are rotting and being replaced with scientific and philosophical frameworks. The argument isn't whether remnants exist, it's whether the central nature of the belief system has been fundamentally changed by the successful, ongoing emancipation of the mind.
Both of our views rely heavily on the long and often bloody history of the conflict between faith and reason, detailed so meticulously in the source.
Absolutely. The listener must consider whether the intellectual retreat and forced modification of religious beliefs proves a fundamental change in the nature of faith itself, rendering the primitive roots inert, or simply demonstrates the continued necessary role of atheism and secular reason to push the process of enlightenment forward.